For those of us who are used to long commutes to work, we know that transport and spatial planning are some of the key challenges to Cape Town becoming a carbon neutral, equitable and more resilient city. Today, Peter Ahmed and Jodi unpack some of these challenges and start to suggest some of the ways that we may be able to overcome them.
Good afternoon from just outside the Cape Town International Airport. My name is Peter Ahmed. I'm a manager for the Spatial Planning Unit within the City of Cape Town. And I'm joined here today by Jodi from PwC's Cities Unit. Jodi, welcome. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks, Peter. Nice to be here.
Today, the conversation is around some of the drivers of change within our cities, the issues of the day, if you like. And you've written quite extensively about this, not only working with PwC, but in your own blogging and approach. You've talked about things like climate change, urbanization, technology, and the migration issues, which are all driving different parts of the sort of spatial agenda of cities, not just within South Africa, but more broadly. How have you thought about these from the outset? What has framed your thinking around these issues?
It's an easy question to get started with, Peter. I think part of what informs my thinking on these issues is understanding what cities and local governments started out doing. And they really were places where people came together to find efficiencies in how we trade and build life as society. And local government started as a way of primarily focusing on public health and bulk service provision. Water and sanitation provision was the sort of nexus of local government, and everything we've done on local government since then has built up on that sort of fundamental focus of provision of basic services at a bulk scale to enable the sort of economic activity that happens inside cities. Obviously, in different contexts, it's taken different forms, and cities have different functions and mandates based on their political economy and that sort of thing, but that's fundamentally what they do. Recently, or I think with the sort of rapid changes around climate change, populism, rapid urbanization, as you say, there's increasing pressure for cities to take on more and more functions, more and more tasks to tackle these problems that are quite different and a lot more complex than the sort of basic service provision of the past. So my focus in my career and in my thinking is around how do we build the capacities and competencies of cities to tackle these sorts of challenges that we're going to face in the future. And it really is maintaining that basic competency to kind of keep the lights on and keep the basic service delivery going. But building on top of that also a set of competencies that help people to think about the future, to show leadership on these strategic issues, to work with communities, to understand the citizen experience and citizen expectations of them, to both influence global agendas on these topics and bring programs down to the community level that actually help us to adapt to and mitigate these really big, sometimes quite scary drivers of change facing how we live in our cities.
I guess what's been interesting, Jodi, is that at times we've seen some of the cities actually take the lead in some of these issues and some of those global agendas, and they're signatories to different protocols and so forth. How do you think that is starting to, again, shape our understanding of the city's role within that space of driving some of these themes and the climate change, the carbon neutrality, etc.?
Sure. No, absolutely. Cities have been at the forefront of a lot of the agenda setting, and we've seen cities in some contexts actually go against what their national governments are advising or suggesting at a policy level or on a global platform. And that really does put us in an interesting position around what is the role and what do people expect of their city government. Some will say that's that's going a step too far and you must focus on keeping the basics going, and others will sort of applaud their city leaders for taking that initiative. I do think there is an inherent value in helping to set that agenda, because eventually those things come back down in terms of your targets, your indicators, everything that you appraised and measured against, funding programs that might land in city spaces that help you to implement infrastructure programs that are innovative or interesting in reaching out to new targets. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I would caution against participation in that where it's purely about sort of visibility. Visibility is a part of it, but you need to be getting something back from that engagement and those platforms, also in terms of maybe additional technical assistance or technical support. And cities need to have, as part of their strategy, how are we going to influence agendas upwards, and how are we going to use that to bring back down what we need to implement and reach our intended outcomes as a place.
We've seen here in Cape Town the last 2 or 3 years, we've had the drought, major implications for the sustainability of the city, the resilience, these ideas of sustainability and resilience, and obviously right now still dealing with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, how do you think these are helping us think about not just these perennial challenges of resource sustainability, but these shocks that come and are testing us, testing cities, testing the ability to govern, and the economies that you say. Cities are about transaction. We've seen what the impact of that has been in terms of diminished transactions, local economies, city economies really facing quite stark realities. So again, those two things that come to my mind when we think about shocks to the system. And maybe again some thoughts around what we can learn and where we're going with these things.
Sure. I mean, I think Cape Town is in quite a unique position and has done fairly well in terms of being proactive on learning about what we learned from the drought and what are we learning now through COVID. And I think some of the things that we've learned there are around, we have to have a certain amount of our resources that continues with the bigger plans, the long-term vision, keeping basic services going, but we also have to have resources and capacity available and ready to deal with shocks as they come, and these sort of system-wide disasters as they come. I think another key learning is to understand that vulnerability to these shocks sits differently in different parts of our city, and our ability to build out more sort of resilient and sustainable cities, especially in Cape Town, is very much linked to our spatial form. And I know the City of Cape Town has done good work in terms of mapping and understanding vulnerability to different shocks and stresses, including climate change, and needs to now do that work in terms of understanding how do you go into specific areas and have more targeted approaches to reduce the vulnerability in certain areas, and that should feed into some of your longer term, bigger picture planning. And that's just augmented with your sort of disaster response, so that your disaster response isn't just sort of repeatedly year after year going in to deal with floods and fires year after year. So I think there's a lot more that can also be said there around just the data tools, the engagement with community. Through both the drought and COVID, we've had a huge mobilization of community groups to support. And I think that's something that's really important and really powerful to understand around local government as consisting of and being a part, the people are a part of local government in our constitution, and the way in which communities have come together to stand up and say we're going to work together to reduce our water use in the drought, to provide social safety nets in COVID. This is really valuable and very powerful, and I think as civil servants to find ways of tapping into those networks, not only for our disaster responses but also for some of our longer term ambitions and targets, is there's a real opportunity there.
It's really interesting you're touching on that. I mean, I'm thinking now from a sort of spatial visioning aspect. We've seen recently the National Spatial Development Framework being launched in draft form. There's a provincial spatial development framework, and obviously within the city there's a municipal spatial development for these different levels, if you like, of planning. Do you think there's still room for that? Is there still the sort of the grand plan and the grand ambition? Whilst we're on the one side trying to deal with the reality of the year and whatever's been thrown at us, is there the importance of that grand vision? Do you think that those are still important aspects that we need to keep in the back of our mind, particularly if we're thinking about aspects of inclusivity, transformation, etc.? How do you think these two things work together? Look, I mean, we often are criticised saying we've got so many plans and not enough implementation, and I think there's a lot of validity in that. But I do think that there is importance in long term and sort of
citywide planning, to the extent that they set outcomes against which we can now appraise our actions and our investments and how we dedicate our budget and our resources as local government. And I think those words like inclusive and integrated and sustainable, and we need to be able to they mean different things to different people, very different things to different people. So we need to be able to translate that into outcomes that we can, like I say, appraise our activities against, and have those long-term goals. If you think of things like the carbon profile of the city of Cape Town, a lot of that is linked to the spatial form, and that does require real sort of focus on planning around the spatial form. Things like fixing our transport network, realigning our areas of higher density and lower density to have more sustainable movement patterns and things like that through the city. That has to happen at a certain scale and over a certain time frame. So I think you do need that planning that deals with that scale and that time frame, while also having these resources that can deal with the uncertainty and crises of the moment.
You mentioned density there, and I think that's been really one of the interesting things to watch over this last 6 or 7 months, has been how the conversation has evolved, where we've heard about de-densification, for example, of informal settlements that typically are quite compact and very dense spaces, versus a grand ambition of a cities to become more dense and less sprawling and more intense. So I guess that comes down to some of the infrastructure, that's the means and the spend of cities in relation to that can ultimately drive some of those outcomes?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's also, we talk about a density plan for Cape Town and things like that, and I think we can be quick to forget that there are parts of our city that are incredibly high density but underserviced. Sure. And I think a part of what our sort of long-term planning needs to do is have a much better understanding of the citizen experience in those spaces. Make sure that we are really spending time in those spaces, understanding what the needs are, understanding how infrastructure is and isn't used, how faults do and don't appear, and I think have a balance in our approach around not necessarily de-densifying, but having appropriate urban forms of density, so incremental upgrade, allowing for formalization of informal spaces. We're seeing a lot of that enabled by the city's planning policies, like having as of right second and third dwellings. I mean, it's huge in terms of the sort of so-called micro development that's taking place, and that improved quality of an existing level of density that's happening. So I think that's really important. And then there are other areas that are more formalized, but actually very low density compared to what is needed for a sustainable compact city, for a city where we have low carbon emissions because people have shorter distances to travel, where people have greater access to opportunity, where there is this social integration that we talk of, and that we do need, again, a different form of infrastructure investment and enablement to allow for that to happen. I'm talking now more about the sort of main road corridors and the Voortrekker road corridors in contrast to a township or informal settling.
And those corridors typically going to be supported by some degree of public transportation, strong linkages to social amenities and the nodal framework and so forth. So, I mean, Jodi, along those public transportation corridors, along those access, you talked about Voortrekker Road is one example within Cape Town. What are some of the supporting elements to that? I'm guessing public transportation, strong social amenities. These are some of the things that we would associate with that type of intensification and a diversity of land use within that space? Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're wanting to see some redevelopment and reinvestment in these areas, going higher density, and that opportunity is also really good from a built environment perspective for low carbon buildings, that retrofitting of existing buildings as you densify them, as you convert to commercial or residential as might be needed. That offers another opportunity to, as I say, retrofit and get more energy efficient buildings in those corridors. And as I say, brings the compactness of the city closer together. So where you've already got existing infrastructure in the rail corridor, of course we have major issues with our rail corridor, fundamental threat. Major issue, yes. Seeing some
early positive signs of the modernization program being implemented and things slowly, relaunching a few lines that were closed. So cautiously optimistic about that. But, if we can get that right, that I think will really be quite a big fundamental to the way in which we've conceptualized our whole city spatial form is around the rail network, my city bus networks, and the routes that the minibus taxis take. And I think we have come from a history of quite a high, relative to other South African metros, quite a high usage of rail in particular as public transport. So getting back to those levels or higher will be further enabled by investment in that infrastructure, which is tricky because it's not a city mandate. But also investment in the land parcels and identification around that then allows for that high frequency usage of people using those modes of transport. Yeah.
Let's pick up on this transportation element, because if we look at what the City of Cape Town is looking at, it's quite an ambitious program of working towards carbon neutrality towards 2050. And what we know in terms of the stats and the figures is that, in terms of energy consumption, in terms of the most carbon emissions, transportation is the biggest sort of contributor within the Cape Town context. So this idea of a public transport, I guess, of getting more people into more clean methods of transportation would be fundamental to that. I guess this is one element. There is obviously the whole green buildings aspect and how we can make buildings. Let's talk about the transportation just a bit more in terms of what do you foresee is coming within the city space. I know we've had the My City, you've talked about the rail and potentially are there other elements that we should be thinking about?
There's definitely a lot of other elements that we can think about. I think the role of technology in transport, how those two intersect, is really key. Transport and urban mobility has been massively disrupted by the concept of mobility as a service, mobility as a platform. The sort of e-hailing services being the most common example of that. In Cape Town, we've got a huge growth in delivery vehicles, motorbike delivery vehicles in particular. And these are all forms of traffic on our roads that contribute to our overall carbon emissions on the streets, contribute to demand for space, contribute to how our streets should be laid out and space on our streets should be shared. So these are all things that we are battling to predict and keep up with, battling to know when should we regulate, what are our appropriate levers as local government, when is it regulate, when is it enable, when is it maybe directly invest in. So these are things that we need. Obviously the fundamentals are there in terms of the rail infrastructure. We just need the rail service operating on the rail infrastructure. The existing minibus taxi industry is really, really strong, and there's been some interesting pilots in Cape Town around experimenting to see can we get them operating on a regular schedule as opposed to waiting until they're full, and the impacts that has for a commuter in terms of just waiting time and the sort of comfort and predictability of the experience, as well as what that could mean for efficiency of the system. So these are all processes where there is good progress. And there's a lot of groundwork to build on. And certainly the city's investment in My City has had a lot of intended outcomes in terms of land value add, sustainability, enabling movement in different communities, and those are all also being revisited and reviewed to understand, well, what have we learned from that first phase, and what does that mean for future role and investment in rapid bus transport. So these are all elements of a transport system. For me, fundamentally, walkability is another one. We sit here in the greenest hotel, but a stone's throw from the airport, but I can't walk from here to the airport. That is fundamentally a problem. And so I think that lower level of how we engage with and think about using space and mobility, right down to where can I walk and where can I cycle, also needs to form a part of our thinking.
One of the things that you drove and co-founded, Jodi, was the Open Streets Initiative here in Cape Town. And that seems to have gained momentum, certainly pre-COVID. It gained momentum over a number of years. It talks directly to the use of space along certain streets within the city, and talks very much to the idea of pedestrian access, cycling, skating, all those things which are zero contributors to the carbon emissions. Please tell us a bit about the history of the Open Streets program and how you see that as a contributor to all of these things, the idea of integration, of accessibility, of inclusivity. And I really would like to hear that.
Sure. So Open Streets is based on the Bogota, the South American model of ciclovia, which is closing out streets and embracing them as public spaces where people can recreate in whatever way they want. So it encourages mobility by skateboarding, walking, cycling, pushing a pram, whatever, but also come out and perform if you're an artist, or just enjoy some family time. And it's been a complicated journey to get people, especially city officials, to understand it, because it does try to achieve a lot of different things. It has objectives that are around social integration, a very strong focus on building empathy and connection between neighborhoods and within neighborhoods, a very strong focus on the relationship between the street and the economy, and how do we enable an active ground floor, a vibrant, economically active ground floor that's not just sort of cold facades or monopoly businesses, but lots of mom and pop shops, things like that. It's very, very healthy for a strong city economy. And then, of course, a whole set of objectives that are around mobility and how people use streets to move around, and how we can encourage more sustainable, non-motorized forms of transport. It's been loved by many communities because of the way in which we put the days together. So bringing communities involved in the design and activation of what happens in their space has had a lot of very powerful legacies in those communities. And one thing we've really struggled with is converting it from an event to a sustained program, and Cape Town has pedestrianised very little. It's pedestrianised St George's Mall in town.
Quite some time ago.
Yeah, quite some time ago. And small stretches of roads here and there, but very little. And what I have found now in the last couple of months, and even more in the last couple of weeks in response to COVID, is a lot of streets that are popular for business, so have existing business, vibrant businesses. So I'm talking about Bree Street, Long Street, Lower Main Road in Obbs, Main Road, Musenberg, that St James Strip. These are well-known streets for people to have businesses and activity on. They see an open streets kind of initiative, a pedestrianisation, as a key part of recovery from COVID.
Right.
It provides opportunity to be outdoors, safe. There's a whole public health safety element to it. And of course it might, it's summer now, people want to be outdoors, it attracts people. What we battle with is there's no clear process for how to go about doing that. And I think that's something where, if the City of Cape Town is also on board with these multiple objectives around pedestrianisation, walkability, low carbon forms of mobility, connecting communities, integration and economic recovery, providing a process and a platform for groups like this to know exactly this is what I need to do, these are the steps I need to follow, and I will be able to achieve this outcome once a month or twice a month, or maybe regularly every evening in certain neighborhoods. I think that would be a sort of a really powerful enabling move.
So trying to embed it within the institution as opposed to, as almost a program, as opposed to a once-off, and then it's forgotten about. So something for the city to think about and learn from there. Bogota, Colombia, obviously where the inspiration for Open Streets comes from. Are there other places around the world, whilst you've been researching, and many of us sort of surfing the net over these last few months during the COVID period, is there anywhere that you're taking inspiration from, that you're thinking about looking at other examples where we could be considering, whether it's in a Cape Town or South African context? Any other examples that have given keen interest from your side? Sure.
So I think the first thing to say is Cape Town actually does often a lot better than we give it credit for. I'm not shy to criticize Cape Town, the City of Cape Town, but actually, working with them and also with other cities, there are a lot of things that Cape Town can be very proud of, and I think often international experts and things like that come thinking that, it will be easy to teach us something, and realize that we're far further ahead on our thinking and planning than they might have anticipated. I do think that we can be learning more from other African cities, especially around how we deal with informality, how we embrace informal economic activity as a part of our development path and development trajectory, to not mimic where we want to be at the end of it and just assume that we'll get there, but to actually start with where we are and work upwards from there. I think there's a lot more we can be learning from other African cities on that. And I think broadly, regardless of where you're learning from, it goes back to one of my earlier points around have that role of trying to influence and global agendas, but also have a strategy around what you want to bring home and what you want to learn. So I think instead of just sort of saying, well, let's go out and learn, we have to know what are we looking for? What is the stumbling block that we've reached in our own strategy and plan? We've set a target, for example, 2050 carbon neutrality. That's our target. We have certain elements of our plan. I think we need to be able to assess where are we performing well, where do we actually have things to go out and teach others about, and what can we get in exchange for that learning to fill some of the gaps we have. I think some of the gaps might be in the financing space. We've been actually quite lucky to finance most of our infrastructure directly historically. So far, and that might, I think that those sorts of things might start to change. That might be a place where we start to say, look, where can we learn from in terms of more innovative financing models?
So Jodi, as we work towards a wrap, final question from my side would be to say, if we think towards the future, two questions for you. What do you think is realistic in terms of a fairly fundamental change, if any, to the urban structure here in Cape Town? And second of all, what would you like to see? What might not happen, but you would want to imagine is possible on the back of this disruption, and trying to work from that basis that with every crisis, don't waste it. What's the opportunity that comes out of a very serious issue of the pandemic, very serious issue around the recession that we're facing? So I'm not making light of it. I'm trying to think of a way that we can take some positive and finish on a positive around the spatial and urbanization future of Cape Town.
Sure. So we've spoken before, Pete, about if you just sort of play forward a lot of the trends, it's quite scary. In the future, It can be very easy to be overwhelmed by the uncertainty of climate change, migration, technology, rising sort of populism in our political space. These are things that are very scary and very real, and it can be difficult to think about a future that is somehow progressed to something better than what we have now, that hasn't directly tackled some of those challenges. So for me, what I would really like to see is a lot more sort of centering these issues in our conversations and in our planning and in our workplaces. We need to have more diverse workplaces to be able to do that. We need to have better use of data, but also more time on the ground in communities, understanding what's really going on, where vulnerabilities really lie. And we need to have more accountability on our progress towards these big plans. I think a lot of the big plans are there. We've really done quite solid technical work on understanding what needs to be done, what needs to be achieved, where the focus needs to be. And our efforts now should be on engagement and accountability as we deliver those. I do think that there is opportunity in every crisis. The relationships built through things like the community action networks, I think, is very powerful. I mentioned it previously. Right now, we will see a lot of businesses who previously have maybe not been actively participating in these discussions. They will have a hunger for answers, and that calls to existence a community of partners that previously we found difficult to pin down and access and identify. So I think using it, whatever conversations we're having now, not just to put out messages that make it sound and look like we're doing the right thing, but to actually build the relationships that we need to be able to partner and implement the long-term strategies. I think that's a real opportunity right now.
Jodi Alamaya, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and reflecting on and thinking ahead to what is possible, what we're trying to achieve. All the very best to you and the PwC Cities team, and we look forward to engaging again sometime in the future. All the very best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. Thank you.
We heard some really interesting thoughts about our urban form and the fundamental changes that are needed to make Cape Town a more livable city. Events like Open Streets bring people out into the streets to experience the urban form and to engage with each other. The Cape Town Future Energy Festival still has lots more to offer, and we look forward to engaging with you soon.